My name is David Halloway. I'm 52 years old, and for 26 years I thought I understood my marriage completely. I live in a quiet neighborhood in Sacramento, California, in the same house where we raised our two children, Rachel, now 24, and Connor, 22. My wife, Patricia, and I built a life that felt, by every visible measure, settled. The kids were grown. The mortgage was almost paid off. I thought we'd earned the peaceful part of life together. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday in April, Patricia sat across from me at dinner and said she needed space to rediscover herself. She was firm that it had nothing to do with another man, that she just needed time apart. Not a divorce, just distance. I didn't argue. 26 years of trust doesn't disappear over one conversation. So I agreed, and she moved into what she said was a friend's guest room. Over the following weeks, small things started not adding up. Patricia, who had worn the same practical, understated style for as long as I'd known her, suddenly had a new wardrobe, new hair, a different way of carrying herself. She mentioned attending personal growth retreats on weekends, vague about locations, vague about who ran them. Charges started appearing on a credit card statement I'd almost forgotten she still had access to. Expensive dinners, a boutique hotel in Napa, a jewelry purchase I never saw her wear. Our daughter Rachel called me one evening, upset. She'd noticed her mother quietly removing years of family photos from her social media accounts, one by one, until almost nothing remained except recent solo pictures. Around the same time, our son Connor mentioned overhearing his mother on a late-night phone call when he'd stopped by her new place unannounced, her voice hushed, guarded, ending the call abruptly when she realized he was in the room. I found an old smartwatch of hers in a kitchen drawer, one she'd apparently replaced and forgotten to wipe. Out of a mix of hurt and curiosity, I charged it and let it sink. The location history told a story of its own. Repeated visits to a downtown apartment complex, one I didn't recognize, spread across months that predated her request for space by nearly a year. I hired an attorney, a measured, careful man named Gerald Fitch, who advised me early on to protect my own finances regardless of what I eventually learned. I opened a separate account, documented our joint assets, and started paying closer attention. That was when I found the email alias, a second address Patricia had apparently used for years, linked to a burner phone number I discovered buried in an old family plan invoice. I found records of a downtown apartment lease under her maiden name. I found hotel reservations timed suspiciously around several of her supposed work conferences, business trips for a consulting role I didn't fully understand the details of, because I'd always trusted her explanations without asking too many questions. A neighbor, Mrs. Ferraro, mentioned one afternoon, almost as small talk, that she'd noticed a black luxury SUV parked outside our old house several times over the past year when I wasn't around. Always the same driver, always brief visits. At the time, she'd assumed it was a real estate agent or a delivery. I found old journals of Patricia's tucked in a closet box, years of entries revealing resentment I'd never known she carried, frustrations about feeling invisible, about wanting a version of her life that felt like it belonged only to her. Reading them was its own kind of grief, discovering an entire interior world I'd shared a house with for decades without truly seeing. By this point, about halfway through everything I was uncovering, I believed I understood the shape of it. An affair, likely with whoever owned that SUV, likely connected to the downtown apartment and the retreats. I braced myself for that confirmation and started preparing emotionally and legally for a straightforward, painful divorce. Then everything changed on a Thursday morning, when a man in a gray suit knocked on my door and identified himself as Special Agent Daniel Osei with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. He asked to speak with me about Patricia. My first thought was that something had happened to her. What he told me instead reshaped everything I thought I'd spent the last 2 months uncovering. Patricia had been assisting a man named Randall Voss, a wealthy investment manager under federal investigation for orchestrating a multi-year fraud scheme, moving and concealing stolen investor funds through a network of shell companies and fake consulting contracts. Patricia's consulting work, the same explanation she'd given me for years of trips and late nights, had in reality involved helping Voss funnel money through invoices for services that were never performed, laundering it through accounts that eventually connected back to that downtown apartment, which Voss had been paying for the entire time. The luxury SUV wasn't a lover picking her up for an affair. Not entirely, though Agent Osei carefully noted the relationship with Voss did appear to have a personal dimension as well. It had been driven by Voss's associate, moving her between meetings tied to the scheme. The personal growth retreats were, in reality, closed-door meetings with other individuals implicated in the fraud, dressed up as wellness weekends to explain her absences to family. Almost every strange event from the past year rearranged itself in my mind with this new information. The burner phone wasn't just for hiding an affair, it was for communicating with Voss's network without a paper trail. The secret bank transfers I'd found weren't hidden spending money. They were payments funneled through accounts in Patricia's name to obscure their origin. The storage unit I later discovered, rented under yet another alias, contained boxes of documents, hard drives, and financial records. Investigators had been trying to locate for months. The following weeks were a blur of FBI interviews, both with Patricia and, eventually, with me, since investigators needed to understand what I knew and when. Our joint accounts were frozen pending review, a nightmare Gerald helped me navigate, proving through documentation that I'd had no knowledge of or involvement in what Patricia had done. Forensic specialists working with the Bureau recovered deleted files from a laptop Patricia had used for her consulting, files that traced a clear, damning timeline of her involvement stretching back nearly 3 years, well before she'd ever mentioned needing space. Rachel and Connor struggled in very different ways. Rachel was angry, felt betrayed not just by the secrecy, but by years of being lied to about who her mother was. Connor, quieter by nature, kept trying to find a version of events where his mother was more victim than participant. Someone manipulated by Voss rather than a willing participant in his scheme. The truth, as it usually does, sat somewhere uncomfortably in between. Friends started revealing pieces they had apparently known or suspected for a while. One of Patricia's closest friends, Linda, admitted over an awkward, tearful lunch that she'd known about the affair with Voss for over a year, but had promised Patricia she'd stay silent, believing wrongly that it wasn't her place to interfere in our marriage. Patricia herself, when we finally spoke directly, cried and told me she never meant for things to go as far as they did, that it started small, doing Voss a favor with some invoices at a moment when our finances were tight and he'd offered easy money, and that each subsequent step felt smaller than the one before it, until she was too deep to see a way out that didn't destroy everything. I never screamed at her. I never sought any kind of dramatic confrontation. Gerald helped me file for divorce cleanly, protect what remained of our joint assets that weren't tied up in the federal case, and formally cooperate with investigators wherever it was useful, providing documentation and timelines that helped clarify what I hadn't known. The court proceedings, both the divorce and Patricia's eventual plea agreement in the fraud case, took the better part of a year. She avoided the harshest possible sentence by cooperating fully with prosecutors against Voss, but she didn't avoid consequences entirely: restitution, probation, and the complete unraveling of the reputation and life she'd spent decades building alongside me. I rebuilt slowly. I sold the house that held too many recontextualized memories and moved into something smaller, simpler, entirely mine. Rachel and Connor and I grew closer through the process, bonded by the strange, specific grief of realizing a parent contains rooms you never knew existed. I went back to therapy, something I'd resisted for most of my adult life, and found it gave me language for feelings I'd been carrying without names. What I understand now, looking back over that year of discoveries, is that betrayal rarely arrives as one single catastrophic choice. It arrives as hundreds of smaller ones, an invoice signed without asking questions, a secret kept just this once, a lie told to smooth over an uncomfortable moment, each one small enough to seem forgivable on its own, until one day you look up and realize the distance between two people has become impossible to cross. I don't carry rage anymore. I carry clarity and a quieter kind of strength I didn't know I had until I needed it. If you were David, do you think you would have noticed the warning signs sooner, or do you think betrayal like this is only ever visible looking backward? Tell me your thoughts in the comments, and if this story kept you hooked until the very end, subscribe, because there are more stories like this one coming soon.